from our global audience, Francisco Sandoval, an economic counselor with the Embassy of Mexico, Carlos Vanderloo, a minister counselor for economic and trade policy at the Embassy of Canada, Ed McIsaac, a trade counselor at the New Zealand Embassy in Washington, and Ruth Schipper, a trade counselor at the Embassy of the Netherlands and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Carlos, Ed, Francisco, and Ruth, and thank you for joining us. I'm very excited about this next panel for several reasons and ask them to please turn on their cameras. As many of you know, in 2020, WITC launched a trade and environment series. A lot of what we were discussing about climate and trade in those early days was theoretical. In 2024, a lot of those ideas are turning into action. And today we're looking at some of the critical policy issues facing governments today, trade policies to address pollution and climate change. Welcome today to Matthew Bolden, a climate policy advisor with the Senate Budget Committee for Chairman Sheldon Whitehouse, Christine Harbin, who is an energy policy advisor for Senator Bill Cassidy, Linda Dempsey, a vice president of public affairs at CF Industries, Catrina Rorke, executive director for the Center for Climate and Trade and a senior vice president for policy and research at the Climate Leadership Council, and our moderator, Maureen Hinman, co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Silverado sponsors WITC's Trade and Environment Series, and Maureen and Sarah Stewart and her whole team are fabulous partners with WITC. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Ken. It's great to be here today, particularly with this esteemed panel. So in the wake, and as Ken mentioned, I'll skip introductions since he gave such an eloquent version for all of us. But in the wake of the initial implementation this year of the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanisms, we've been able to convene an expert panel today to remark on the emerging policy landscape on border adjustment mechanisms in the United States. This includes carbon border adjustments as well as regular pollution border measures. And I just wanted to pause quickly and mention, and I think that DG Ellard is absolutely right. Trade is a part of the solution. And usually when people think about that, they think about these border adjustments. So getting the policy is right. And I know there's a lot of very hardworking people in Washington thinking about the ways to get this policy right. Particularly for the United States. So specifically today, our guests will provide their perspective on several topical pieces of draft legislation, the drive behind these bills, and what may be in store for the 2024 legislative cycle. So without further ado, Matt, I'd like to thank you for being here. If you could give us a little bit of an overview of the Clean Competition Act that Senator Whitehouse and Congresswoman Del Bene introduced last December. Thanks for your leadership. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about the elements and why is this is a priority for Senator Whitehouse.
Well, thanks, Maureen. And Ken, thank you for the really kind introduction. And thanks, WITC, for having me today. Just say up top, some of the views I'm expressing today are mine and not necessarily those of the senator. But the Clean Competition Act, which is a lot of what I spend my time on, is really focused on unlocking a market incentive for decarbonization. Now, we've thrown a ton of money at the problem with the IRA, with the IIJA. What those programs didn't include was a sort of a demand side driver, both for firms trying to deploy long-term capital to decarbonize, but also for purposes of defending basically green markets like the one that's emerging in the United States, where we have green steel, we're decarbonizing our chemicals production, we are decarbonizing our cement production. And this policy is really designed to give firms the assurance that the US will be a market that correctly values their low carbon products, their good behavior long term. And all this is coming as the Europeans are already implementing a CBAM of their own. The UK recently announced they're doing a CBAM, and the Europeans in particular really show no sign of backing down. If you've been tracking the gas negotiations, they've been very adamant that it's the CBAM and the rest of the world needs to get on board. This is a tremendous development. It is very hard to see how we get to where the science tells us we need to go in order to be on track with where we need to be for emissions reductions for climate purposes without a network of CBAMs, preferably one that's well coordinated. Now, thanks in no small part to the work of a number of the companies represented on this call, US manufacturers are on average some of the lowest carbon in the world. So as a result, Wood Mackenzie predicts that even if the US does nothing and the EU CBAM goes into effect, it could increase EU market share for US producers. Again, it's this arbitrage for the emissions reductions we've made historically and are continuing to make today. Now, that's some of the why behind the Clean Competition Act. Let me speak a bit to the how. So what the Clean Competition Act sets out to do is use the data we collect today, such as facility level emissions, facility level product volumes, countrywide emissions data, to stand up a US carbon border adjustment. And it creates a framework for trading partners and firms to provide better, more granular data over time to improve that program. We don't trade facilities, we trade products, but we measure facilities for their emissions data and their production volumes data. So using this data, we can determine the average emissions intensity for US industries, basically creating a benchmark, if you will. And any goods coming to this country that are more carbon intensive than this benchmark are charged a fee on their excess emissions. Over time, we ratchet down that benchmark, and the fee gradually rises at a sort of a set schedule. To ensure we in the US maintain that carbon efficiency advantage and align with the type of the CBAM the Europeans are pursuing, the Clean Competition Act also applies that same performance standard to domestic facilities. Now, I would say that, again, it's sort of the way it's set up is it's not all facilities, it's everyone who's beating the performance average as measured in the year this goes into effect. And so you throw in the IIJA money, the IRA money, the investments folks are already making to comply with the methane emissions reduction program, and the 75% of revenues that are raised by the Clean Competition Act, which are then devoted to decarbonization of US industry with preference towards the most emissions intensive facilities. And suddenly there's this vision of sort of the US role in the clean energy future, where we're providing all the steel, the cement, the chemicals, and the other materials we know we're going to need to build all those wind turbines, all those sort of composite materials, all the hydrogen we need to really cut our emissions rapidly. There's also considerations in the bill for complex finished goods, things like cars and washing machines, language in there around least developed countries, how to handle export rebates and the risk of resource shuffling overseas. But that's, happy to leave that to Q&A, that gets a little wonky. But that's the basic outline of the bill and why we're pushing it.
Great, thank you so much. That was a great promotion and outline of the bill. Now turning to another ambitious piece of legislation. Chrissy, thank you for being here today to talk about Senator Cassidy's foreign pollution fee. Thank you very much for your boss's leadership as well on this important issue. I'd love to hear a little bit more as I ask Matt about the impetus for this legislation and what does it seek to accomplish.
Absolutely. And thank you, Maureen. Thank you very much for this conversation today. And thanks to WITA for hosting it. I think Matt laid out the case very well on the impetus for a very similar piece of legislation, one that my boss, Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, is championing. There is a growing concern that the U.S. Is at risk of losing its leadership on a number of really important manufacturing sectors. And certainly as we turn our focus to reducing global emissions and making major investments on these in our operations. And so that's why Senator Cassidy has introduced earlier this Congress the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which has a tremendous number of similarities, certainly a number of provisions as the ones that Matt and has described about Senator Whitehouse's legislation. However, there are a number of important differences as well. Now, this is part of the beauty of doing innovative things here in Congress. So very happy to be an ongoing resource to the folks on the phone. I know that there's a high number of very engaged thought leaders and policymakers there too. So I joined, for background, I joined the office last month. I took up the portfolio from my predecessor, Cole Simons, who moved on to a new opportunity within industry, and I'm happy to be a resource to you all as well. So I'll turn it back to you, Maureen, and look forward to more conversation about these important goals.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. Wow. Now pivoting to perhaps a person who could be called the godmother of carbon border adjustments in the United States and the benefits therein. Catrina, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your research on the carbon advantage and specifically how turning this sort of arbitrage question on its head by incentivizing those benefits can help lead to U.S. competitiveness. Can you talk a little bit about your research and why trade policy tools like border carbon measures should be considered?
Yes, thank you, Maureen. I'm going to take that title to the bank. Thank you for hosting this conversation, for your excellent counsel in this area. You taught me a lot. Thank you also to my co-panelists who have also taught me a lot. It's a real pleasure to be working on this niche subject, but maybe you at home want to weigh in too. We welcome numbers. I want to sort of frame my research across 3 topics: the carbon loophole, the carbon advantage, and then the economic benefits from leveraging it. And I'll try to be snappy because Matt's already laid out a little bit of this narrative and Chrissy's doubled down. But let's take the concepts one by one. The carbon loophole. Roughly 25% of global emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions, are related to the production of goods and services in one country that are ultimately consumed in another. Trade is one of the most significant drivers of greenhouse gas emissions globally. We will not address the climate crisis at the scale and speed required unless we take into account the emissions associated with traded goods and services. Full stop. A second concept in the carbon loophole is that the vast majority of global trade flows sort of ship carbon off the balance sheets of more climate ambitious countries and onto the balance sheets of less climate ambitious companies. And that has to do with the carbon advantage. So many of the largest exporters internationally, here's looking at you, China, have relatively low climate ambition associated with the carbon intensity of goods they produce. China, India, Russia require 3 to 4 times the amount of emissions as the US to create the same dollar of value in the global economy. That means that when we're sourcing goods through international trade from less ambitious economies, not only are we shifting emissions abroad, but we are often increasing the emissions required to satisfy that demand. That is a really significant concept to consider when it comes to addressing the carbon emissions associated with traded goods, because we're not talking about a level playing field here. We can and should introduce policies into the trading system that acknowledge the relative carbon intensity of goods based on where and how they are produced. We do not have tools to address that at present. The vast majority of climate policies are focused domestically and on the activities of facilities, not on the quality of goods that are produced. And so the third concept I want to talk about are the benefits associated with doing that, introducing a policy so that you can account for the carbon emissions associated with traded goods. It's hard to get really granular data for most sectors, but we've been able to do this analysis for the steel sector. And we've identified that if you introduce a carbon price on the emissions associated with the production of steel goods, you can, in the US economy, drive up sales of domestically produced steel about 9%, increase the profitability of existing steel firms in the United States about 40%, and cut imports in half. This is a climate policy generating real and material economic benefits for an emissions-intensive industry domestically. That is a sea change in how we think about the politics of climate action. By introducing a trade element, we can improve the prospects for American competitiveness, improve the prospects for investment in American manufacturing by acknowledging these differences in carbon intensity that underpin the carbon loophole. So that's why this is a really important area for policymaking.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, Linda, these policies are going to impact your global firm in so many jurisdictions and so many ways that you do business. I'd love to hear a little bit of details on how you're thinking about this and thinking about what optimal looks like with regard to border adjustments.
Thank you so much, Maureen. All my WITC friends, it's great to be back. I appreciate the opportunity to be with these great panelists who talk about our views at CF Industries. We're a global hydrogen, ammonia, fertilizer producer that's seeking to decarbonize by 2050. Like the other panelists here, trade is absolutely a vital piece of the puzzle for those industries like mine, which are energy intensive, trade exposed, to be able to take the steps and make the major long-term investments to decarbonize, and at the same time, create new demand for low emissions products, address the global climate challenge, but also incentivize better, cleaner production that's not just good for everybody, but is going to help grow more resilient jobs and local communities that I think everybody knows is really vital. You know, Catrina talked about the carbon leakage loophole advantage and all of that. And I just think for commodity EITE industries, this is an absolutely critical issue, right? If we're going to be able to invest the amount of capital for investments that are 20 years, 30 years, 40 years in operation, right, then we need that certainty and the right frameworks. And the trade rules as implemented today favor the cheaper products, right, which are not the ones that require that new investment. And the work that Senator Whitehouse and Senator Cassidy, their expert staff, and their colleagues are doing is absolutely vital to get the right policies moving forward. Both of their proposals would create strong incentives to address global emissions and ensure that industry in the United States, our workers, our communities, are the ones that are going to lead in creating cleaner production technologies. And those are products that, you know, we're not just seeing some demand here, we're seeing global demand. And so we want to be at the forefront of that. And this is something that's good for manufacturing, it's good for jobs, it's good for communities. If we don't address these issues, right, the EU is moving forward in a really strong way. They're writing the rules today. You know, those of us who have been around trade for a long time here in the United States know that the rules developed overseas are not always the ones that we in the United States would, right? So, you know, it's really important that the United States at this moment work together to develop these types of rules ourselves and work with our international partners, absolutely. And I think both of the senators' proposals are seeking to do that. So I look to hear more from both of them.
Thanks so much, Linda. Well, we've heard that there are climate, competitiveness, economic, manufacturing, and jobs benefits to these policies. So great, let's sign up. Really easy peasy. But maybe not so much in our current political climate. So I'd love to turn the mic back to Christy and Matthew in turn to talk about some of the challenges ahead for getting these policies over the finish line and what they envision for the 2024 legislative cycle.
Happy to talk about challenges, but I'd like to first weigh in on a point of optimism, because I feel like for many folks on the line, it's probably not common to see an R and a D on the line with such shared interest and shared perspective here. But I think within climate and energy policy generally, there is a striking amount of consensus positions that the political parties can agree on. But that said, moving over to challenges, there's a lot of noise in Washington right now. I know I can't speak for Matt's boss, but I know my boss has a full calendar of competing priorities. I think he had 3 simultaneous hearings this past week that he was participating in. So there's just a lot of other issues going on. And so I think in order to continue this drumbeat and continue this momentum for a common sense trade policy that achieves all these energy security and manufacturing goals while reducing emissions, I think it's really important to hear from industry participants, from hearing from folks in the audience, and also picking up the great notes that Linda just had to ensure that we know that this is a continued strong priority across the energy industry.
Thanks, Matt. Any thoughts from your end?
Well, if she gets to be optimistic first, then I get to be optimistic first too. I think there's tremendous opportunities ahead of us for, in terms of how do you actually pass something this technical. I mean, in 2025, for instance, there's a number of the provisions of the Trump tax cuts that are expiring. I think there's going to be a lot of searching for revenue raisers. If we have to be paying tariffs to the Europeans, the UK, I think that's a great opportunity to start taking those tariffs back and putting in a CBAM of our own. There's permitting reform going on in the background, which is a necessary ingredient to getting any of these policies to work quite right. We can't have the sort of large green steel hydrogen economies here if you can't build the facilities. So that's an important part of this. And as Chrissy said, it's sort of a common sense policy. I mean, as I think Catrina and Linda laid out very eloquently, this is one of the rare issues where environmental ambition and like economic bottom lines line up really, really neatly. And I mean, I think, we haven't even talked a lot about sort of the geopolitical angle of this. I mean, particularly as, the Select Committee on China, the fact that exists, this Congress, I think is evidence enough that this is an important question we should be thinking about. What does the economy look like vis-a-vis US and Chinese competition going forward? On sort of the obstacles, I think, as I said before, this is a technical policy. I'm a climate person. Occasionally, I play a trade person on events like this, but I'm first and foremost a climate staffer. So I very much, really open an invitation to everyone on this call, folks who know the different industries far better than I ever will, to please reach out, help us design these policies, help us figure out what, if you don't want to talk to the Dem, you can talk to the Republican. Chrissy's very friendly, I assure you. Or you can talk to the Dem if that's your flavor preference as well. We do want to get these right. We do want these to work. I mean, these are very, these are very large policies in terms of the scope of goods they're trying to cover. But the world's moving here. So like Linda said, either we let the Europeans write the rules, or we start producing numbers of our own and showing why US goods and why US producers are doing the right things today and why they should be rewarded for it. I'd also say, in terms of obstacles, as Chrissy said, we're in, I think her boss said, well, silly season, given the election. So, expect there's going to be a lot of work behind the scenes to figure out what these policies should look like. I think, there's been a lot of focus, frankly, just on like, oh, the IRA happened, let's focus on tax credit implementation, which is the important thing to focus on. Let's focus on political hand-wringing over the IRA on the other side of the aisle. There's a lot of, that's taken up a lot of the space in the room and a lot of the energy and time that I think really ought to be devoted to thinking through what comes next. What are the sort of long-term policies that actually create that demand-side signal and create economic opportunity so firms can make those long-term 20, 30-year capital investments and get us to net zero and set us up for the future. So again, I'll end on an invitation. Please, folks, don't hesitate to reach out. These versions of the bills are probably not the ones that are going to pass. The versions that can actually pass are the ones that we're going to benefit from your expertise.
Thanks so much. Well, I think that was a really good segue into a question I'd like to ask Linda next, which is, with the multiplying measures over the world, how important is sort of convergence of these measures, interoperability of accounting standards, and how the overall policy design and making sure that the incentives are right and that you can still do business?
Absolutely important, right? I mean, if you're trying, we're a global producer, we're selling around the world. If we've got to do, 3, 5, 10 different systems being developed around the world, that's, a lot of wasted effort and a real problem, right? And having these different accounting rules. I think it's really important, and this is why we're so keen on having the United States become very involved and start developing the rules and working with others. I mean, they're part of the Global Climate Club that's expanded beyond on the G7. There's discussions there very early, as far as I can tell. In terms of that carbon accounting, how do you do this for, my world of nitrogen and hydrogen? There's a limited number of products, right? If you're doing, the metals, there's a heck of a lot of more products there. There's all sorts of different production methods. Now, I will say one of the things that many of us in industry are working on are certification systems, right? Because some of the first things we're going to see with clean products is, producers, suppliers selling to customers that want it, whether for government reasons or commercial reasons. And so these certification systems that industries are developing are going to be absolutely critical. They're going to need to be interoperable, and we're going to need some sort of mutual recognition. I think all of this is converging at the same time. It's highly complicated. But I will say at COP, there was the positive development of a mutual recognition declaration among many countries on hydrogen certification system. There's a lot of other products out there as well, but I think that's the type of thing we need to see. But if the United States isn't in the game, how are we going to develop that global type of system?
Thanks so much, Linda. And I do think it's highly technical. One person on this panel who's kind of grappled a lot with policy design, some of the technical matters is Catrina, and I'd like to hear a little bit from you on why policy design matters and what the sort of cost benefit is of getting the policy right versus wrong.
Yeah, this is opening quite a can of worms. So let's take it at a high level. Linda alluded to this earlier. It's not just about introducing accountability into the trading system. It's about encouraging the trading system to move toward a preference for lower carbon goods made in a more sustainable fashion. The United States acting on its own, the European Union acting on its own cannot execute that for the global economy. So that means that even as we introduce a system of accountability for the most carbon intensive producers, we want to introduce it as close to the global trading system as possible. That can only be achieved through partnership. And so the number one sort of guiding force in policy design has to be that there is a pathway towards encouraging additional partners to come on board with a similar policy design so that we are pricing as much as we can in the global economy of those most carbon intensive products and finding avenues for greater competition for those lower carbon alternatives. If we can execute a policy design approach that helps us do that, that's a greater climate benefit, that's a greater economic benefit for those clean firms. And this is building on what Matt was alluding to earlier, greater geopolitical benefit. We can further check the power in the global economy of these authoritarian actors who are exporting carbon intensive goods as a mode for gaining sort of geopolitical market share, let's say. And so that's why we have to get it right, because the global trading system demands it. And that's a pretty good reason. But also, we want to make sure it's executable. And I've been, like Matt, working primarily on climate policy, and I play a trade policy analyst sometimes on TV, but there's always a balance between comprehensive, perfectly executed policy and an administrable policy. And we are certainly confronting that when it comes to the climate and trade nexus. About half of global market capitalization in some way discloses the emissions associated with their operations. 40 countries require disclosure of the carbon emissions at a facility level. These are firms and facilities. These are not goods. There's a technical hurdle. How do we get to the emissions associated with an individual traded good? A number of shortcuts are available. Maureen, you yourself are a scholar in this space, have highlighted where simplifications and administrability Don't jeopardize the climate or the economic benefits associated with these policies. That is an excellent place to start as we build the global infrastructure for product level emissions reporting. Awesome. Okay, so let's find a shortcut so that we can get as close to the perfect as we can and still build it out the gate of a product level emissions accounting standard. Okay, great. What goods do we apply this to? The energy intensive sectors could all demand inclusion in this. Linda laid out the reasons why. We require these sectors to make significant long-term capital investment decisions to decarbonize, and it is so hard to justify those investments in a market economy when you are facing low-cost competition from an inferior product whose producer is not facing that demand. And so the energy intensives, obviously. Okay, so now what about those portions of the economy that use a whole lot of energy intensive inputs to make a good? Do we care about extending this to machinery, to autos? Great question. This is a question for policymakers about where you draw the line between comprehensiveness and administrability. It's also a question for those firms. Do they want to be included in such a policy? Do they want to get credit for the relative carbon efficiency with which they produce goods, the relative carbon efficiency of the materials they source? We know a lot of firms are driving towards improvements in supply chain visibility, including the carbon intensity of what they buy. Okay, so what goods do you cover? What gases do you cover? Again, Maureen Hinman, great literature on this. You should check it out. But we can start with CO2. CO2 is more comprehensively measured. We have greater reporting on that worldwide. Methane is a huge source of carbon emissions internationally. Our ability to measure and report those emissions, not terrific. Okay, now you get to sort of the next order. What other greenhouse gases do you need to account for? Should you be accounting for? And where do we need to start today? So what gases do you cover? And then who runs this program? Who is collecting the data? Who has expertise? We have pockets of expertise all over the federal government. How do we build this so it is administrable out of the gate? We're leveraging the expertise we have. We're not duplicating it somewhere else, but also we're orienting it around an agency that doesn't carry a lot of political baggage. So these are just some of the questions in policy design that guide whether we can get the maximum climate economic benefits, whether we can get it over the finish line, and whether we can execute it once it is over the finish line. There's a lot to think about in this space, and perhaps I should stop blathering and let's get to the Q&A part where more specifics may come up. Thanks.
You're not blathering at all, and thank you for the shout out on some of my work. I am actually the opposite. I am a trade expert who sometimes moonlights as a climate expert. So this has been a sort of beautiful convergence of worlds. I know that there are some questions in the queue, and I believe that Linda was raising her hands to, there we go, to answer a question related to fertilizer. Linda.
Sure. So one of the questions was in the chat was, actually now I'm trying to find it. There's already political pressure to lower tariffs on imported fertilizer because of high cost to farmers, and past studies on steel tariffs have shown that they cost jobs in steel consuming industries such as automakers. How do you prevent the higher costs inherent in cutting out dirtier steel or other products from other countries, Brazil, Mexico, et cetera? So let me start with just a factual setting, right? There are no MFN US tariffs on fertilizer imports into the United States. Only tariffs that there are in the trade remedy world, where those products have been shown to be unfairly traded and injurious to a domestic industry. The US has the most competitive open market for fertilizer in the world. That being said, this issue of the impact on the downstream is a really important one, and we agree with that, right? It is important in the fertilizer world for our producers, our customers, our farmers, right, to continue to be globally competitive, to be able to sell here at home as well as overseas. And so I think it's important to bring those industries into the conversation, right? Early into the conversation to help prevent negative inadvertent impacts. But let me turn it around, because there is huge opportunity here, right? sustainable aviation fuel using low emissions ethanol, low emissions ethanol used in low carbon fuel standards, climate smart agricultural policies, food companies looking to decarbonize their entire food chain, right? This is a game changer for the long term, right? So if we're not just thinking today and tomorrow, but we're thinking about the next 5, 10, 20 years, it is important, I would argue, for our agricultural producers to have more of clean fertilizer here in the United States so that they can reap the rewards of higher value products being sold in all these different markets, from food to aviation and beyond. And so I think there's opportunity. I think everybody should, have a part in the conversation.
Thank you, Linda. And
Linda,
go
sorry,
ahead, Catrina.
I just want to add one more component. Yes, to everything Linda said, but also there's a difference in quality between a tariff and a border mechanism that's intended to lower the carbon intensity of what gets imported into the United States. And it is that a carbon border adjustment is avoidable. So if you have really carbon efficient production, you're going to avoid that cost on your good as it gets imported into the United States. And if you are really carbon intensive, you cannot. It is an impetus to reduce the carbon intensity of the goods you produce if you want market share in the United States. And it's a reward system for those firms that are producing those lower carbon goods today. You don't have an inevitable across the board hike with a carbon border adjustment mechanism. You are targeting the most carbon intensive traded goods to the United States.
Great. Well, I think this has been really interesting. I'm gonna land with one final question, and I'm going to combine two of the questions to just talk about some of the technical challenges. And I know that, as Matt said, this is a very wonky area, but I like to roll around in the wonkiness. First, the world of unintended consequences in complex supply chains and complex products. How do we make sure that we're not creating tariff inversions that incentivize offshoring? And then second, what do we do about developing countries whose built infrastructure usually isn't there from their driving from their domestic population and their ability to adjust as well? I will throw that out to the group, and anyone can chime in on their thoughts.
I'll say a couple of things, and then Catrina and Linda, who have thought about this more than I have, I'm sure, please, and Chrissy as well, please jump in. On the issue of transshipment, I mean, I would say, the way the Clean Competition Act tries to address this, it leaves it rather broad when it says what is country of origin. I mean, realistically, for different industries, different products, it's going to be a lot more specific than that. It's going to be country of smelt, country of pour, things like that. It's really because we're talking carbon here, again, we're not talking sort of across the board tariffs. What you want to isolate are where the carbon intensive processes are happening across the supply chains. And that, I think, simplifies it quite a bit. Now, of course, tracking that can be less than simple, but there are already sort of trade remedies and trade tools in place that exist that can sort of bat back against efforts to do transshipping and sort of hide the country of origin. I would also add on the other question of like sort of the details of like how do you actually do this what Catrina and Linda were talking on earlier. I mean, the one sort of method for determining, as you go down the supply chain to more complex goods, the question is, how do you operationalize where you draw the line? One way the Clean Competition Act tries to do it is it offers one threshold built on sort of the weight of the covered content in the car or the washing machine, whatever. Say if you have more than 500 pounds or more than 125 pounds, it ratchets down over time, and then is left to the discretion of the Secretary of the Treasury. We do a roll up of all the sort of the weight of the goods, and then we look up their country of origin, and that's the how it's border adjusted. There's also, as you can see in like the USMCA, the bill also considers using a value of material inputs, which makes probably a lot more sense for more of the complex chemicals that Linda deals with and is referring to. How much does hydrogen weigh? Well, atomically, not very much. So, I mean, there are going to have to be different systems for dealing with complex goods. Here are two of them. I'm sure there are better, more thoughtful systems for how to isolate these, particularly sort of purpose-made for different industries. And would very much welcome your feedback as we continue to work on these bills.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to weigh in?
I'll weigh in briefly. I think this really highlights some of the complexity of this issue and the importance of getting the details right. The Foreign Pollution Fee Act does include a number of provisions in there related to international partnerships, and certainly gives a lot of ink to developing economies. For low and middle income economies, it has an arrangement to encourage them to establish a partnership with the United States and with certain requirements. And I'm happy to share more details and get feedback with folks on the line. But this kind of partnership would require a similar trade policy that discourages market access to high pollution intensity countries, eliminates the foreign pollution fee on products within the partnership that are within 50% of the pollution intensity of the US, lowers the trade barriers for US exports to partner countries, and also encourages pollution data sharing and verification, much like we discussed earlier today. So that said, this is part of an ongoing conversation. How do we treat all these other developing economies who also want to work with the US in reducing emissions while deploying a lot of while supporting manufacturing?
That's great. I think that we have covered a tremendous amount of ground in a very brief 45-minute panel. I want to thank all my panelists for their insights. I myself am very excited about the prospects of 2024 and also an optimist. Please check out everyone's respective websites on these issues, and we look forward to our next WITA environmental convening in the next couple of weeks. Ken?
Thanks so much, Maureen. Before I let you guys go, do I sense that there's a feeling like a consensus can be reached? One of the questions was asking about whether or not you think that there's enough common ground to reach a consensus to be able to move forward on some of these critical issues, notwithstanding that there's the timing on the calendar and such, and getting legislation passed is always a difficult exercise.
What do you think, Matt?
I think they pay me to say yes. I would observe that. I mean, looking at the question you're referencing, I think one of the really neat things about this policy is even if you really don't care about emissions and you're some really, really red meat, I just don't want to deal with that. I think the other countries should go first. That's your sort of stance. There's economic reasons to do this. There's cold, financial calculus here. There's geopolitical reasons to do this. You can still have 2 out of 3, and that's reason enough to pursue a policy like this. And actually, I would encourage folks who really don't want to do this for the emissions reasons. I would encourage them. That's all the more reason they should get in here and get involved in the conversation and provide their perspective on the right way to do this, because there's so much that we're just leaving on the table if we don't engage in this conversation. If we sort of sit by as the rest of the world zooms ahead towards these types of carbon border adjustment mechanisms.
And my optimism continues as well. There's a lot to work to be done, but looking forward to working with everyone assembled here in our elsewhere in our community on this.
Well, that's the note we love to end some of our WITA sessions on, where we can try to find common ground and agreement even on issues that are so difficult, such as these. Thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate it, and please, we look forward to having you back on to continue the discussion of the